folks. I think we are in week 10. I think it was week 9. And we're getting towards the end of the semester. Today's lecture will be given to us also by a rabbi. And this fellow's name is Bob Mendelsohn. And Bob has a very interesting story of growing up as a Jewish man and living out the Jewish faith, and then a bit later on, I think it was in his 20s, Bob might talk about it later, also came into contact with the Jewish Messiah, which changed his life totally. Bob also went to one of the very famous, very well-known seminaries in America to study Jewish studies. And perhaps, Bob, you could just tell us a little bit about that background. And I've asked Bob to give this lecture today on Jewish law, and also for him to talk a little bit about the broader idea of the Judeo-Christian influence upon our law and our culture generally. It's a legacy that's so huge that often we miss it. Like the saying, we miss the woods for the trees. It's so prevalent, so huge upon our society here in Australia that we often just take it for granted and just presume, oh, that's just normal. That's where it's always like that everywhere. That's actually not the case. So, Bob, look, thanks again. I really appreciate the time that you give up to teach our students about Talmudic law, trying to locate this in world history, and especially, as I was just saying, how great an influence that this has been upon the history of the world, and continues to be so. So, look, thanks again, and I'll hand over now to Bob Mendelsohn.
Thank you, Daniel Kelly, in Darwin, Northern Territory. Well, we watch the news on the television, and at times we get upset, almost angry. I remember the 1976 movie named Network with that once Aussie actor, Peter Finch, who won the Academy Award for his acting, albeit posthumously. He played a news presenter who went manic with his producer, Faye Dunaway. He was upset by the injustice in the world. And he screamed, and he had people across the United States screaming out their windows, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." Pop culture, which highlights injustice, abounds with movie scenes from Norma Ray in 1979, where Sally Field's character is a young single mother and textile worker who agrees to help unionize her mill despite the problems and the dangers involved. We cheer for her when she stands on the table holding the sign "Union" and shuts down the factory. And who can forget Meryl Streep in the movie Silkwood, where she played the title character? Silkwood was a metallurgy worker at a plutonium processing plant who was purposefully contaminated, psychologically tortured, and possibly murdered to prevent her from exposing blatant worker safety violations at the plant. Injustice. We hate it. And we applaud those who fight against it. I speak with many people about religion, and most who don't believe as I do will tell me something like this. They'll say, "It doesn't matter what religion you have, as long as you don't hurt anyone. You try to be good." That moral tone seems to be the new religion of the 21st century. But that ethic of love and not hurt is not as universal as we would hope. Consider the outrage we feel when we hear of a homicide bomber who kills 60 people in Lebanon at the United States Embassy back in 1983. Or 6 months later when over 300 were killed in the barracks of the Lebanese. By the way, I refuse to use the word suicide bomber. If a suicide bomber just killed himself, none of us would even notice. But these are homicide bombers. They're murderers. In 2004 at the Australian Embassy in Jakarta, 9 were killed and 150 injured by a terrorist who killed himself as well. In 2002 at a restaurant in Haifa in Israel, and the Bali bombings, the Moscow theater, and last year in Nice, France, and Lahore, Pakistan, innocent children walking on a footpath or in a park. It's showing no signs of stopping. Our outrage is abundant, and we continue to appeal to something we call human decency and some kind of ethic, which is ours. So from where does that ethic come? I believe it's rooted in our Judeo-Christian heritage. And that's not only an American reality. I grew up in the middle of the United States, moved here to Australia 19 years ago. I see that Judeo-Christian heritage influencing our Australian legal landscape as well. In his article, The Concept of Neighbor in Jewish and Christian Ethics, Michael Fagenblatt says this: "The commandment to love your neighbor as yourself plays a central role in both Jewish and Christian ethics." But then he goes on to highlight the misunderstandings of that simple command by the Christian church. In his clarification of the church's concepts of neighbor, Fagenblatt references the Golden Rule. Commonly, that's understood to be do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Although he argues that the Golden Rule was in various pre-Christian citations, it was only in Jesus that the link with the love commandment was used. By love commandment, I mean the two great commandments of Jesus, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. In order to understand the legal systems of Australia, and certainly throughout the West, one must understand the roots of these systems, and that requires the awareness of and deep investigation into the Mosaic Constitution, which can be called the Law of Moses, or in Hebrew, Torah. According to the story in the book of Exodus in the Bible, Moses was 80 years old and ascended Mount Sinai in order to meet with the Almighty. There he was given the 10 Commandments on 2 tablets of stone, and the interpretation of them in what is titled the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Those words which he heard, and apparently either memorized or scribed, are now what we would call Torat Moshe, the Law of Moses. These are the first 5 books of the Jewish and Christian Bible, sometimes called the Pentateuch. But we also must always be able to interpret the law in new needs or new situations never imagined before, and see if the principles, the postulates, the precedents, protocols, and even the minutiae of details are applicable to each situation of life. Moses would never have imagined laws detailing plebiscites about same-gender marriage, nor regulations for birth control pills, or elevators, lifts, hybrid cars, or hybrid golf clubs. How does Jewish law develop and help us in our modern Australian culture to be fair, to give everyone a fair go, or however we choose to define a simple Hebrew word, tzedakah, or justice? The Torah uses this phrase, justice, justice shall you pursue. That's in Deuteronomy 16:20, which sounds right to be mentioning here at the outset of a lecture on Jewish people and law. It could be an academic reckoning, but it goes well beyond that. The verse of Deuteronomy finishes with this quote, that you may live and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you. The end of that seeking for justice is a peaceable and healthy living in Israel, the promised land, with relationship with the Almighty and other people clearly in view. So, how are Jewish people to accomplish this? We need to know what to do, how to do that, when, where, with whom. In other words, we need a full measure of instructions about life in the midst of existence. If we're supposed to live peaceably with one another, what are the boundaries? What are the stipulations? What is required? What's prohibited? Or are we left to our own devices? And if that be so, then who determines moral right from wrong. After all, if, as Feigenblatt avers, the simplest of rules from Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself, finds misunderstandings in Christian circles, then how is someone supposed to sort out the more difficult issues and commandments? Now, that's why you see the quandary in which Jewish people, actually all people in all societies, have to try to sort out and coexist. The issues of freedom and boundaries is one with which philosophers, lawyers, certainly religionists, and every teenager I know has struggled. So we've compiled a set of data filled with both regulations and precedential rulings on one hand, along with stories to amplify and illustrate. This is called the Mishnah. The Mishnah consists of 6 orders, Sedarim, singular, Seder, each containing 7 to 12 tractates. Masechtot, the singular Masechet, the literal version, that word literally means web. There are 63 tractates in total, and further subdivided into chapters, paragraphs, and verses. How are we to understand some of the rules given in Torah without some kind of commentary of sorts? For instance, the Bible uses this phrase in the 10 Commandments: keep the Sabbath day holy. What does that mean? When one looks for the specific biblical laws regulating how to keep the day holy, well, there are some rules against lighting a fire, leaving one's dwelling, cutting down a tree, or plowing and harvesting. But would refraining from these few activities fulfill the biblical command to keep the Sabbath day holy? In modern days, Sabbath rituals that are most commonly associated with the day, like lighting of Sabbath candles, eating and drinking certain foods with their commensurate prayers, reciting the Kiddush, and the reading of the weekly Torah portion and Haftorah section are found, but not in the Torah, but in the oral law. In the Talmud, we learn of 39 types of work which are strictly forbidden on the Sabbath. The list will be later at the end. For you to understand the Jewish concept of regulations, let me tell you the story about an oven. Yep, I said an oven. And how to determine who makes rules about its usability. Let me give you a glossary. There's a fuller one later on, but let me give you this for the next scene. The words are halacha. I'll tell you them as I go. Halacha, which is a ruling, if you will, a precedential legal ruling by lawyers in the past. The word comes from the Hebrew halach, meaning to go, and means figuratively the way to go. And thus halachic is the adjective form of this noun. Agadah, this means story. Agadah is the other portion of the reading of the Talmud, the Jewish interpretation book of the whole Older Testament. Rabbis, that's another word to use here, are those religious leaders after the fall of Jerusalem. That happened in 70 CE, who assumed the authority in the religion, since the priesthood was eliminated without a temple. We didn't have the worship center there at the temple. Are we okay, Daniel?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, all good.
Okay.
Thanks, Bob.
Rabbinic authority is standard in understanding the Jewish people today. And a word not used in our text, as I'm going to read you about the oven here, is the word kosher. And that means a lot more than certain foods like pickles or bagels. It has to do with being fit for use. In the story I'm going to tell you, the opposite is used. The term is ritually impure, that is, not kosher. This means that something is not usable. There are rules on how to make something usable again, but that's not the focus of the tale. The story of the oven is an illustration, which is prompted by conversation the rabbis are having about women and how men should treat them well. They should be honoring their wife, lest he bring dishonor to her. So that's the overarching subject. And then this, by the way, is in the Talmud in Bava Metzia. I thought I'd show you. This is just one of 5 volumes. And you can see it somewhat. It's pretty detailed. So this is the Steinsaltz edition. This is just Bava Metzia, and this is volume 1, but I've got all 5 sitting right here next to me. So this is found in chapter 4, 59a, that is the right side. So here's the seminal story from Bava Metzia. The setting is that the Talmud mentions the case of some particular type of oven and debates what exactly its characteristics are. Was it cut in pieces, mortar was inserted, or sand between the layers, broken, etc.? Maybe I can show you. That's the picture of the oven. And I'll show it over here as well. That's the picture of the oven. Okay. And why rabbis are discussing an oven, that's another story. I don't have to explain that.
That's what I was thinking, Bob. Why are the rabbis talking about ovens?
Because that's what you do. You talk about every circumstance of life. Why do I have to tell a lawyer that you've got to deal with legal things? All right. This brings, let's see. So it brings down this oven, brings the events ensuing from a debate among the rabbis over the ritual status of the oven. Is the oven impure now? Can it be used in such a broken condition? The item is called the oven of Achnai. What is Achnai? Some leave it as a name like Panasonic or Samsung, and others translate it to a coiled oven, like one which could be represented by a snake. All right, these debates are very common. In fact, the Gemara is the recording of these debates. In this case, the sages held that the oven was susceptible to ritual impurity. Sages are the majority of those who were assembled. But a certain rabbi named Rabbi Eliezer maintained that it was not impure, that it was kosher, it could be used for cooking. But he didn't concede in the face of the majority, as usually happens. By the way, this wouldn't mean that he was wrong, merely that the law followed the other, the stronger opinion. It's not the same thing. So here's the actual text in Bava Metzia. The oven of Achnai. It has been taught, on that day, Rabbi Eliezer brought forward every imaginable argument, but they did not accept them. He said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let this carob tree prove it. Immediately, the carob tree was uprooted 100 cubits out of its place. Others affirm 400 cubits. No proof can be brought from a carob tree, they retorted. Again, he said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let the stream of water in this aqueduct prove it. Whereupon the stream of water flowed backwards. They rejoined, no proof can be brought from a stream of water. Again he urged, if the halacha agrees with me, let the walls of the schoolhouse prove it. Whereupon the walls inclined to fall. But Rabbi Joshua rebuked them, saying, when scholars are engaged in a halachic dispute, what do you have to do to interfere? Hence the walls did not fall in honor of Rabbi Joshua, nor did they resume the upright in honor of Rabbi Eliezer, and they're still standing in this way inclined today. Again he said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let it be proved from heaven. Whereupon a heavenly voice cried out, why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, seeing that in all matters the halacha agrees with him? But Rabbi Joshua arose and exclaimed, it's not in heaven. What did he mean by this? Said Rabbi Jeremiah, that the Torah had already been given at Mount Sinai. We pay no attention to a heavenly voice because you have long since written in the Torah at Mount Sinai, this quote, after the majority must one incline, end quote. Rabbi Nathan met Elijah and asked him, What did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that moment? He laughed with joy, he replied, saying, "My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me." And that's the end of the Talmudic story. And if you're not used to this type of argumentation, you might be scratching your head and wondering, so who won? What was the real...
what's the answer?
What's the real argument? What was the precedent from which this ruling came, etc.? Well, as is typical, no one won, but the majority held the previous, that the oven of Achnai was unusable. The ending statement by the Rabbi Joshua is a citation from the book of Deuteronomy, albeit only a phrase. Deuteronomy 30, verse 12 says this. It references God's Torah. The actual quote is this: "For this commandment which I command you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it out of reach. It is not in heaven that you should say, 'Who will go to heaven for us to get it and make us hear it, that we may observe it?' Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, 'Who will cross the sea for us to get it for us and make us hear it, that we may observe it?' But the word," Moses says, "is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may observe it." What did he mean by this? Rabbi Yirmiyahu explains that it means that since the law was already given at Mount Sinai, we cannot take advice from any other heavenly voice, since it already says in Torah to follow the rule of the majority. That was his quote. But, friends, it's a misquote. In other words, he says, now that God has given the law into our hands, it's in our hands. Not even God has the right to mess with the legal system he established. We can outvote God. I so apologize that yesterday's live broadcast was interrupted by an iPhone restart. I don't know why, it just did that. So I will finish part 2, if you'll allow me. This was given yesterday in a lecture to law students at Charles Darwin University. The university recorded it, but I don't know that we will have access to it all at once. At the end of the broadcast, we actually had about 25 minutes of questions and answers, and I think it was pretty good. So let's finish this part 2 of Jewish People and the Law. We ended yesterday's episode with, not even God has the right to mess with the legal system he established. We can outvote God. And then things unfold in the next section, which we did not read, about the social impact. Rabbi Eliezer's excommunication, not quite the same thing in Judaism as it is in Christianity, for refusing to accept the rule of the council. The difficulties that ensued, because even though they were right to do it, to maintain the authority of the legal system, he was still in some sense wronged, and God doesn't let such things go by easily. It gets into a different topic here, which is really how it all came about in the first place, since the topic the Talmud was discussing was people being wronged. The whole business, though, of we can outvote God is a pretty incredible message. It's a view of divinity that I think is quite unlike that of Christianity, but on the other hand, it's a view that considers that God could vest his authority in humanity and trust them enough to make it theirs and not his. Is that what the Deuteronomic passage is meaning? Consider the verse in Exodus, which is used in the story as well. That's how Jewish law is decided. Note the power of the rabbis to translate and interpret and thus create new laws. Rabbi Yirmiyahu said, after the majority must one incline. Okay, this clearly says we can vote and a majority will determine what the Bible means. But I disagree with the translation. Let me show you the verse in 3 other versions of the Bible and in context. Here's the NIV. Do not spread, this is Exodus 23, 1 through 3. Do not spread false reports. Do not help a wicked man by being a malicious witness. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd, and do not show favoritism to a poor man in his lawsuit. The Masoretic text says, Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou bear witness in a cause to turn aside after a multitude to pervert justice. The Stone edition translates this, Do not be a follower of the majority for evil, and do not respond to a grievance by yielding to the majority to pervert the law. So in the verse in question, the poetry is clearly synonymous parallelism and not antithetical parallelism, as the Talmud might argue. Wow, make one wrong step in translation and you can build an entire regime, an entire false conclusion from it. What the rabbis did here in Exodus 23, verse 2, is exactly opposite of what the clear meaning of the text renders. No, it says, do not go along with the majority, the Hebrew word rav, but do the right thing. So what's my point? I appreciate the care and the storytelling of the rabbis recorded in the Talmud. And I appreciate the bigger story surrounding the oven, which highlights for me the need to care for my wife and honor her regularly. But to self-authenticate and grab for power, that's way out of bounds to me as a thinking person. That said, do you see that the rabbinic authority is clearly enhanced by a wrong translation and thus guaranteed even to modern times? Okay, this makes sense, really. Everyone has a go at interpreting Bible passages to create nuance or meaning, even as I just did. And everyone will interpret things based on many factors. The Apostle Paul looks at the very same passage there from Deuteronomy about the word not being in heaven or in a distant country and says this. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we are preaching, that if you confess with your mouth Yeshua as Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart man believes, resulting in righteousness, and with the mouth he confesses, resulting in salvation. For the scripture says, whoever believes in him will not be disappointed. The rabbinical student named Saul, Shaul, came to believe in Yeshua in a radical story and got a name change to become Paul. And he used the Talmudic method of taking one verse and making halakha out of it. His interpretation is that the Bible is available for everyone, and not that the miraculous nature of Eliezer's proofs were to be discounted. Paul is convinced, as I am, that relationship with God through Yeshua the Messiah is available to everyone, Jew and non-Jew alike, and it's not too far away. It's available. Everyone creates nuance and interprets the texts, even as you hearing this lecture are doing as I speak. The rabbinic justification for Jewish people to follow their majority opinion never diminishes. Now, do Jewish people only think that Jewish people should keep and honor the laws they received at Mount Sinai? Yes and no. Jonathan Klawans argues in his writing, The Law, like Paul the Apostle, that the rabbis, after the destruction of the temple, developed a list of Noahide laws, that's the sons of Noah, that constitute the minimal legal obligations imposed on Gentiles, that is, non-Jews. These 7 laws of the sons of Noah are in force to this day, and the first is preeminent: establish courts or justice. Biblical narrative being true or not, and I'm one who believes the narrative is true, let us turn our attention to the code itself and determine the agents, the realm, the categories, as the Torah has laid the groundwork for our system of justice. Some will know that there are themes where Torah informs the Jewish people related to the theocracy, temple religious practices, domestic relationships, land rights, citizenship, and such. The Torah lists 613 such commandments, but that's hardly the end of it, as most students of law would well understand. Laws about air rights in today's societies, that is, air above the land we purchase with our house, seriously impacts our relationship with neighbors, don't they? If you have a house on an escarpment and your neighbor down below someone buys that house, you want to make sure that they don't build too high to prevent your view of the Tasman Sea or the ocean and such. So you buy the air. I don't know that Moses would have ever seen that coming. The Mishnah contains thousands of regulations, including leaving stones at tombstones when visiting or breaking the glass at a wedding, tossing breadcrumbs into the river like we did a couple days ago on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. It's all there. And it's commonly called the oral law, even though it's all written. But originally they say it was handed down orally. I mean, think about it. How many Jewish slaves coming out of Egypt could read? Probably zero. How did they pass on the traditions and learning of the people that was handed to them? Probably it was all oral. And people back then were able to maintain stories told and retold, especially those tribal stories which engaged the heart and which concerned the deity. Although parts of the Mishnah read as boring legal recitations, and pardon me, all you law students, but Rabbi Judah the Prince sometimes made the text a bit more lively by presenting minority views, which it was also hoped might serve to guide scholars in later generations. We read that in Mishnah Eduyot 1:6. In one famous instance, Rabbi Judah cited this warning judges gave to witnesses who bore testimony in capital cases, and some of these sentences are classic in even the most modern Jewish worldview. The Mishnah begins, "How are witnesses inspired with awe in capital cases? They are brought in and admonished as follows. In case you may want to offer testimony that is only conjecture or hearsay or second-hand evidence, even from a person you consider trustworthy, or in the event you do not know that we shall test you by cross-examination and inquiry, then know that capital cases are not like monetary cases. In monetary cases, a man can make monetary restitution and be forgiven. But in capital cases, both the blood of the man put to death and the blood of his potential descendants are on the head of the witnesses until the end of time. For thus we find in the case of Cain, who killed his brother, that it is written, 'The blood of your brother cries to me,' Genesis 4:10. But the Hebrew says, 'The bloods of your brother cry unto me.' That is his blood and the blood of his potential descendants. Therefore, the Talmud says, was the first man, Adam, created alone, to teach us that whoever destroys a single life, the Bible considers it as if he destroyed an entire world. And, it goes on to say, whoever saves a single life, the Bible considers it as if he saved an entire world." That's a quote you might remember from the movie Schindler's List. Furthermore, only one man, Adam, was created for the sake of peace among men, so that no one should say to his fellow, "My father was greater than yours." Also, man was created singly to show the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be he. For if a man strikes many coins from one mold, they all resemble one another. But the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, made each man in the image of Adam, and yet not one of them resembles his fellow. Therefore, every single person is obligated to say, "The world was created for my sake," Sanhedrin 4:5. One commentary notes, "How grave the responsibility, therefore, of corrupting myself by giving false evidence, and thus bringing upon myself the moral guilt of murdering a whole world." Well, this is so important that the two witnesses to a capital crime were also the executioners. Let me explain. Let's say that several people all saw a murder or saw someone committing adultery. The men of the area would nab the perpetrator and bring him to court, to justice. The court would hear the testimony of the witnesses, and there had to be at least two, as the Torah teaches, Deuteronomy 19:15. Then the court would determine guilt or innocence. All right, let's say the man was guilty. The punishment announced. Let's say he had committed adultery. The Torah teaches in Leviticus 20, verse 10, if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. Okay, the law is clear. The punishment must be carried out. And who will carry out the execution? They're the two witnesses. Can you see how this might limit the willingness of false witnesses to come forth? If you're responsible for both the apprehension and the execution of the criminal, hopefully, if your witness is false, your conscience will at least curb your enthusiasm, if not prevent it altogether. Mind you, the death penalty was not easy to obtain, and the courts were extremely reluctant to enforce it. It's clearly a deterrent that was more about the sin than the punishment. Machot 1:10 says, a Sanhedrin, the ruling body, that puts a man to death once in 7 years is called destructive. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says that this extends to a Sanhedrin that puts to death a man once every 70 years. Rabbi Akiba and Rabbi Tarfon say, had we been in the Sanhedrin, none would have ever been put to death. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamaliel says, they would have multiplied shedders of blood in Israel. Listen to this partial list of requirements to prevent capital punishment. The witnesses could not be related to each other, nor could they be related to the accused. The witnesses had to see each other, and both of them had to give a warning, hatra'ah, to the person that the sin they were about to commit was a capital offense. And if the Beit Din, that's the judging community, arrived at a unanimous verdict of guilty, the person was let go. The idea being that if no judge could find anything exculpatory about the accused, there was something wrong with the court. And the list goes on. Obviously, the requirements were designed to prevent the death penalty from being enacted. And what were the means of capital punishment in those days? There were 4 of them: strangling, burning, stoning, beheading. Strangling. The witnesses, remember the 2 witnesses, would take a rope on either side, wrap it around the neck of the accused, and they would pull from both ends. In the case of burning, the witnesses would, after strangling, pour hot liquid like melted lead down the throat of the guilty one. Stoning would take place in a quarry by the accused. Remember, the accusers would go to the top of a height, at least twice the height of the accused. If he were like me, 6 feet tall and change, they'd stand on a height 12 feet and change. They would then push him. The 2 executioners, remember the 2 witnesses, would push the accused into the pit, which would usually break his neck. The accusers would then throw the first stones, and the community would join in afterwards. Beheading was more accurately stabbing by the accusers. You see, the witnesses were the primary executioners. Perhaps the story of the woman caught in adultery in the Newer Testament is more familiar to some of you. There, an unnamed woman is caught in adultery and brought, or shall we say, made to stand trial in front of Yeshua. The harsh words and their harsh manner are clear. They made her stand before the group, and they said to Jesus, "Teacher, which you can bet was not said in honor. This woman was caught in the act of adultery, in the very act. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Yeshua bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. This is recorded in John chapter 8, motorcycles in Bondi. John chapter 8, verses 3 to 6. The situation is rabid. The intensity and violence are spitting off the page as we read it. It's an entrapment of the woman. It's obvious, isn't it? I mean, why is there just one person there at the court? You see, it takes two to tango, and the man who was with her should have also been killed. But where was he? Maybe this was a sting operation. The punishment is clearly defined, but Yeshua appeals to something higher. He writes in the sand, and many wonder what he was writing. Here's the rest of the story. It's in chapter 8, verses 7 through 11. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote in the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Yeshua was left and the woman still standing there. He straightened up and he asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." "Then neither do I condemn you," Yeshua declared. "Go now and sin no more," or leave your life of sin. Obviously, Yeshua agreed with the rabbis that the death penalty was to be limited, but he said some other things in this story which stand out. He did not diminish the law at all. In fact, he elevated it. From Kilgallen and Weber in their book, Beyond the Commandments, we read this: "The purpose of the law was to bind the Hebrews to God and direct their lives to the more perfect worship of God." When Yeshua made the requirement on the executioners that they themselves were to be completely sinless, he actually elevates the Torah to higher than even the Jewish leadership were accustomed. Now the executioners didn't just have to see the scene and be witnesses. Now they had to be holy as well. They had to be sinless, he says, and each one walks away. First the older, because they knew their sin and were willing to admit it first, and then the younger ones. What Yeshua doesn't say, and what is implied, is that he is able to cast the first stone. He was holy. He never sinned. So according to his own rules, he could have cast the first stone, but he chose a forensic forgiveness instead. I say it was forensic since he didn't actually issue any words of forgiveness. He basically declared the trial a mistrial. That is, there was not going to be a trial since there were no witnesses. Then he turned to the woman and he said, "You're free to go." Only he reiterated the biblical mandate, which should have been something she maintained before. He told her, "Leave the life of sin." With the freedom that Yeshua gave her, she could live a clean life forever. By the way, I think Yeshua was writing in the sand a 2-column listing with the names of the rock holders on one column and their primary sin on the other column. Menachem, adultery. Issachar, murder. Reuven, ben Eliyahu, and he would list my sins. No wonder they walked away dropping their rocks and hoping he wouldn't accuse them anymore. That's just my gap filler, although it's informed by 2 biblical texts in Exodus 31, verse 18, and Jeremiah 17, verse 13. Why do we have courts in Australia anyway? And why is there an appeal process within them? These are also informed by the Judeo-Christian heritage we have. The first courts that the Jewish people employed took place outside of Israel. It happened in the wilderness right after they left Egypt in the Exodus about 1500 BCE. Moses was in over his head with situational decision-making. Jethro was Moses' father-in-law, and the scene of this encounter is especially worthy of our notice today. This is from Exodus chapter 18. The next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you're doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses answered, "Because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and laws." Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you're doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me. I'll give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them the decrees and laws and show them the way to live and the duties they are to perform. You shall select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and you shall place over them as leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Let them judge the people at all times, and let it be that every major dispute they will bring to you, but every minor dispute they themselves will judge. So it'll be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people will also be able to go to their place in peace." So Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he had said. That's Exodus 18, 13 to 24. So the first courts for the Jewish people were in the wilderness and were a chain of lower courts and a supreme high court, ruled over by Moses himself. This system worked well then and continues in some forms of Jewish life to this day, and is noted earlier in our Australian legal system as well. We've just finished the Sabbath here in Sydney. It's Saturday night. And Sabbath observance is preeminent in Jewish life in these days, certainly as related to law. Ask most Jewish people one rule or something to fulfill in their Jewish expression of faith, and it would most likely have to do with the Sabbath. So on Fridays, morning and even in the afternoon, in major cities worldwide, from Moscow to Manhattan to here in Melbourne, young Jewish girls will walk along Jewish neighborhoods asking women they encounter, "Are you Jewish?" And hearing after they say, "Yes, I am," they'll say, "Will you perform candle lighting tonight by a certain time," the candle lighting time. And if the answer by the Jewish woman is, "No, I don't think so," then the girls invite this Jewish woman into a mitzvah mobile. That's a van, a caravan, a people mover or something, or just right there at the curbside, where they can light candles, and that'll be enough for them to count. It will count. So why do they do this? Some sayings tell us what will happen when all Jewish people worldwide keep the Sabbath. In Shabbat 118a, we read, "If Israel were to keep 2 Sabbaths according to the laws thereof, they would be redeemed immediately." In Exodus Rabbah, the Midrash on Exodus Rabbah 25:12, we read, "If Israel kept the Sabbath properly even for one day, the Son of David would come." That's the Messiah. Why? Because it is equivalent to all the commandments. As I said earlier, how we keep the Sabbath holy is barely uncovered in Torah, but it fills a volume of Moed and other passages in Talmud and Jewish writings ever since. An interesting Sabbath legality relates to the Eruv, E-R-U-V, Eruv. The word means mixture. Time for some water. An Eruv is an area within which observant Jews can carry or push objects on the Sabbath. The Sabbath, remember, lasts from Friday at sunset till Saturday, sunset and a little bit. Without violating a Jewish law, the Jewish people need an eruv, because without the eruv, these things are prohibited. We can't carry anything except inside the home. There are, by the way, worldwide over 200 eruvs around the world. An eruv must be completely enclosed. The area is not enclosed by building a special wall around it. Most of it is enclosed by existing natural boundaries like railway lines or walls. What matters is that the area is completely enclosed by boundaries that conform to Jewish law. Britain's first and biggest eruv was created in 2003. The eruv around Golders Green and Hendon is about 11 miles long and encloses 6.5 square miles. The Australian Jewish News reported a year and a half ago this: previous attempts to establish an eruv in St. Ives have been met with stiff opposition and controversy. Comments on the North Shore Times website spilled over into the realm of anti-Semitism, while Channel 9's A Current Affair claimed in 2011 that Orthodox Jews were trying to turn the area into a religious enclave. The New South Wales Land and Environment Court in 2012 upheld Ku-ring-gai's council refusal of a DA, of a development application, to erect a pole on public land that would have completed the eruv. So was it to be an enclave? An eruv is created using physical features like walls and hedges, railway lines and roads to completely enclose an area of land. The open spaces between the existing features are filled in by erecting poles, by erecting poles with nylon fishing line or wire strung in between, hardly a giant closure of a wall. The poles and lines are regarded as forming doorways in the boundary. The poles are the sides of the door, and the lines are the lintel, the top of the frame of a door across the top. The flimsier parts of the boundary are inspected every week on Friday morning to check that the boundary is intact and that none of the fishing line or none of the poles has fallen down. In other words, the fulfillment of the eruv is creating a home out of the neighborhood. Thus, we think we're fooling the Almighty with fishing line into his thinking that we're still at home. And thus we can carry objects previously forbidden, like the keys to our house, books, prayer shawls, nappies, reading glasses, etc. It's a legality that borders on the ridiculous. But in 200 communities worldwide, it's standard operating procedure. I just was visiting a man down in the southeast eruv. Just last week here in Sydney's southeast near Maroubra, another eruv was established. How about Sabbath lifts or elevators and lights? In Israel and some major cities worldwide, one will find major hotels and even some boutique ones with a very slow elevator which operates on the Sabbath. The elevator will stop on every floor, going up and going down. Why? Because a Jewish person is forbidden from kindling a fire on the Sabbath, and thus he cannot push the button on the lift to take him to a certain floor. But if the lift stops at each floor and he hasn't himself pushed the button, then he hasn't broken any regulations. The same thing happens with electric lights. We are prevented from turning them on and off, but if they're on and we enter the room, we can enjoy their glow. That brings me to the subject of the Sabbath Gentile. Although the rules are fairly strict about what cannot be asked of a non-Jew, the popular practices are wide. I had a Sabbath Gentile who would come to my university room in 1969 in St. Louis, where I was attending Washington University, to turn on my light on Friday evening and turn it off on Friday night after I came back so I could be ready for bed. He would then return on Saturday, turn it back on for me during the day, and then when I came back from synagogue Saturday night, I could turn it off. Where there are laws, there will be lawyers. Where there are lawyers, there will be rulings and loopholes and machinations of trying to win cases. That's standard in the Jewish world and certainly here in our Australian world as well. Conclusions. I hope, by the way, if you're watching part 2, that you'll go back and look at part 1 so you can see all the threads that we've touched on, the arc as they talk about it. Well, in preparation for this lecture, I asked on my Facebook page the following. Please give me a phrase, a sentence, a word, even a blog to answer this. When I think about Jewish people and law, I think ... And maybe you'll type in some answers yourself as you're watching this, as you comment on the live video. The majority of the answers were simple as expected, ranging from, I think, of Moses or Sinai, other facts of history, to the almost derogatory, no lobster, oppression and bondage. Most answers demonstrated some negativity toward the law. Then others would join in with alternate views like, well, I think it's holy or righteous, good, family, set apart for God, etc. Therein is the vox pop clarified. The range of feelings about Jewish people in Torah or Talmud or just rules in general is wide. What must be understood is that the current legal system in which we participate today is largely due to the relationship of Jewish people and the law. Dr. Richard Lee says, in order for them, the U.S. founding fathers, to form the documents they wrote, they had to lean upon some common understanding of law, government, social order, and a basic moral code. Those understandings sprang from a common acceptance of what's come to be known as the Judeo-Christian ethic. The term Judeo-Christian refers to the influence of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament on one's system of values, laws, and ethical code. It's not just a system of theological thought, but a culture of values as seen in one's individual's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Some would argue that a few of our nation's founding fathers were not Christians, they were deists. Well, whether they were Christians or not, their writings, words, and votes indicate that the vast majority of them embrace the Judeo-Christian Bible as the basis of a civilized society and social order. It's especially important during these days of rampant pluralism, situation ethics, that pastors and people alike remember these same anchors of faith and values that are brought to us through God's Word. The men of the Great Assembly, that's a gathering of Jewish leaders in the days of Ezra, 5th century BCE, who continued and in new forms continue, are credited with the first sentence of Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers or the ethics of the fathers, which is one of the sections in the Zikin of Talmud. In it are no regulations at all, but only Agadah. In the opening line, they said this, 3 things. Be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a hedge about the Torah. Those 3 pillars are foundational to the Judaism of any age and to the courts which have followed the Judeo-Christian understandings. Without knowing Jewish laws and the Jewish people in a way, without knowing the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua, and what he taught, I don't know how anyone, even in these days, can really understand real justice, real ethics, or real love. I hope this overview of the Jewish people in relation to law is helpful both to the students there at Charles Darwin University and you who are watching this Facebook Live, or much later. As you continue in living out the Australian ideals, as you vote yes or no on the plebiscite, and seek to bring justice to bear in this 21st century. Look, please write to me at the under this Facebook video if you'd like to discuss anything in part 1 or this second part 2 of 2. There won't be a third. I'm happy to be a resource to you in your studies as you continue to search this out. God bless you. Shalom.